I'm Teresa Shecker, and looking this week at the ProQuest Historical Newspaper Database, I chose to look at the Christmas Truce of 1914. I have always found that story beautiful, and I feel like any society, any historical society that looks more into World War I, or even a genealogical society that has family members who served during that time, would find this a beautiful story. This truce covered over a 500-mile area, so it's very likely that this would have affected quite a few people. So the first article I found was Peace Amid War, the Christmas Truce of 1914 by The Observer. And this encounter was with the 19th Saxon German Corps, and it's recording a moving story of humanity during the midst of war. On Christmas Eve in a sector in France, some men from the Irish battalion, they were actually making their plates for dinner, and they noticed, they actually heard a big commotion, and they noticed that across the way, some men from a German battalion had put up these Chinese lanterns, these red Chinese lanterns, and I think they were doing so to kind of celebrate Christmas, but people from the Irish battalion, their sentries had shot them all down. But they started hearing the Germans say, play the game, if you don't shoot, we won't shoot. And so the men were commanded not to shoot, but they said if the Germans come near the lines, the ceasefire is going to be called off. So that night, Christmas Eve night, there was no shooting. But Christmas morning, they noticed 30 unarmed Germans coming out of the trenches with shovels, with spades, and they were doing so to bury their dead. And to the surprise of the Germans as well, some Irishmen came out to actually help them bury their dead. And this was done on Christmas Day. And this gesture caused camaraderie between the enemies. Soon small gifts were exchanged between the two sides. These were things like buttons, badges, coins. The Irishmen actually had British plum pudding because they were attached to a British battalion. They had British plum pudding, and the Germans had German cognac. So they exchanged that for Christmas. This cessation of fighting between the Irish and the Saxons lasted until after New Year's. So that lasted quite a while. And they only began fighting again because the men higher up than them actually forced them to. They gave them orders and said, this is a war. You guys can't just quit fighting. So they forced them to fight. Men on both sides even tried to disregard their orders for a little while. But as men of war must do, the fighting commenced and they went back to war. The men on the Irish side said that it was highly advantageous to them because they were able to work on their lines in broad daylight. Their trenches had begun to flood. This was during the winter, and their lines were actually flooding. The second article I found is titled Alfred Anderson, 109 Last Man from Christmas Truce of 1914. This was by the New York Times, and this covers the story of the last known survivor of the incident. Alfred Anderson lived to be 109 years old, and retells his story of more than 80 years later after the war. He recalls what he calls the eerie sound of silence as soldiers from each side greeted one another on Christmas Day. Mr. Anderson was 18 years old when he served in the Black Watch Regiment. He remembers playing soccer with the enemy and sharing gifts of buttons and cigarettes and even singing Christmas carols. He says the silence lasted for days. He kept calling it eerie. He said that there was months of hearing cracking and whining of bullets. He says that they shouted Merry Christmas, although he says he didn't really feel merry because they had been at war for months. He fought in France until 1916 when he was wounded, and he was later, many years later, awarded France's Legion of Honor in 1998. The last article I found is taken from a letter written home to a mother. The article's title is A Soldier's Story of Christmas Truce in the Trenches, Letter of Captain of Scots Guards, Pictures, Remarkable Episode of 1914 when foes met and fraternized between Flanders lines. Long article title by The Sun. It was written by Sir Edward Hamilton Westrow Hulse. He does his best to put into words what he recalls as the most extraordinary Christmas he has ever seen. The letter starts by saying, "My dearest mother," and continues with, "Words fail me completely." He really didn't even know how to put it into words. He spoke of how they met the German soldiers. So this was actually written by like a Scotsman that was attached to a British line. He spoke of how they met the German soldiers and that they shared how there was no enmity between them and how it was forced by war. And this is something that kind of all three things spoke of. that the lower ranking soldiers really didn't hate each other. They were forced to do this because of war. The Germans said they would not shoot again until they did. So the Germans said, we're not going to shoot at you until you guys shoot at us. And kind of both of the other articles said the same thing. He speaks of gifts exchanged and photos shared between the two lines of men, and addressed this share that they could keep in touch with one another if they survived. I have to admit, when I read that, I cried. So they actually all shared even addresses with each other so they could keep in touch if they all survived the war. The men shared songs that each side knew in common, and they enjoyed Christmas into the coming days together as friends. Thank you, guys.